yesterday. So.
Oh my goodness.
Why TFF?
They know I'm at a furry convention. A few weeks ago for my intro psych class, I taught a lecture on my research because students always want to know, what do you study? So I showed up in a fursuit.
Oh no!
And taught the furry lecture, which delighted me in particular. And they were most of them were delighted too. So, a few of them sat near the back, but most wanted selfies with me afterwards, which was pretty cool.
That is awesome.
Did anybody cancel your course after?
No. Although every year during my evals, I always get a whole bunch of Dr. Plant is awesome, and then one or two people who are like, I wish he'd be more professional. And I don't care about those people.
The fun professors are what makes it great.
Exactly.
I still got a perfect 5.0 on Rate My Professors, so haters gonna hate.
Let's go!
I won't just sit for it. You'll get your money's worth. I'll get up and walk around, but you also didn't pay for this particular talk, so if you hate it, at least it was free. I am an Anglophone, yes. Teaching in a province that is not. Et ma français c'est de la merde, alors. To the one or two people who speak French, that was really funny. So we've got a couple of minutes just before we get started. Out of curiosity, for how many of you have you seen me give a panel like this before?
I've seen that online one.
Yeah. And so for how many of you, I guess it's by extension, how many of you have never seen a panel like this before by me? Interesting. How many of you know who I am? But sorry, I guess maybe background. How many of you have no idea who I am? Why would you come to a panel when you don't know who the person is? I'm kidding. For how many of you is this your first furry fiesta? Holy shit. For how many of you is this your first furry convention ever? Give them a...
Let's go!
That's good. It's good to know your audience beforehand. So we'll start on time. It's 4:28. We'll start exactly on time. I guess I should preface this whole thing by saying that it's a 2-hour block, 4:30 to 6:30 planned out here. I don't plan to talk for the whole thing. It's actually only a 90-minute talk. The rest is for Q&A. So I will also ask, by extension, if you have questions, please hold off until the end. Just because I've done this before where we don't do that, and what happens is we get 30 minutes into the talk and then derailed by questions and never finish the talk. So can we all agree to hold off on questions till the end? Is that cool?
Okay.
Nice.
I promise I will stick around for a half an hour or so and answer questions, after which point I will have to run away very rude because I have to go run 7 hours of werewolves tonight. As a plug, by the way, if you've not gone to the werewolves panel, you should go to the werewolves panel, especially if it's your first con. It's a fantastic way to meet new people. But yeah, so if during the talk, if you're waving your hand and trying to get my attention, I'm not ignoring. Okay, well, I am ignoring it, but it's not because I'm a jerk. It's because I want to make sure we get through the talk. Cool? We can.
Yeah.
All right. Sweet. And also, if we do Q&A at the end, if I don't get to your question, don't panic. I will be at the table all day tomorrow, and you can come ask me questions then. So I know that a lot of people like to ask questions, and I try to get to as many as possible. But yeah, usually there's a lot of questions and only so much time. So I just want to make sure that folks don't feel slighted if I have to take off. There's still chairs and room and stuff here. Yeah?
You say table, where is that?
Oh, the table is just in front of the dealer's den. Literally walk into the dealer's den, and before you walk in, look to the right, and we're there. Look for lab coats. Yep. All right, it's 4:30, which means we will get started. So for those of you who are standing up, there's plenty of seats. Go ahead and get cozy, make friends with some folks. We are at a furry convention. Yes, so welcome to the panel, the FurScience panel. So as some of you standing in the registration line are keenly aware, we wrote a book. I'll be talking about it a bit more, but this panel is based on that book. So for those who are too lazy to read the book, this is the movie version. Yeah, I guess I should establish who the heck I am, because many of you have no idea, and that's fine. I'm not slighted. I am nobody, and you should treat me as a nobody. So, I am Dr. Courtney, man, that's cut off. I am Dr. Courtney Plant, aka Nuka in the fandom. And I guess to establish my qualifications, I have actual research qualifications. I am a doctor, a legitimate doctor. I have a PhD in social psychology. My university greatly regrets having given me one, so I could take this picture right here. I also have furry credentials. I was a furry before I was a psychologist. I've been in the fandom for like 15 years. I've been studying the fandom for like 14 or 15 years. I've been a furry fandom for longer than that, I guess. My math is off. Oh God, I'm old. 20 years? Anyways, I've been doing research for a while. I've been a furry for a while. So you get both in one with me, a furry and a researcher. And even though I'm standing up here right now, I definitely don't want to give the impression that I'm doing this alone. So I'm part of the FurScience team. I'm sort of the big mouth on the team, which is why I end up being the face, the public-facing part of the team. But I'm really just the data analysis guy and the mouthpiece for the team. There's a lot of other researchers on this team. Dr. Stephen Rayson, for example, is downstairs manning the table while I'm being lazy and giving a talk here. So he's from Texas A&M Commerce, so he's a local here. I'm up from Canada, Bishop's University in Quebec. We are both social psychologists. We have Dr. Elizabeth Fine, who is a clinical psychologist up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh perhaps rings a bell to some of you. Maybe there's a convention up there you might have heard of. Dr. Kathleen Grabowski kicked off this work years and years and years ago, back in like 2006. She was one of the first folks to do a scientific study of the furry fandom. She's retired now, but she was at the Niagara County Community College. And my colleague, Dr. Sharon Roberts, is a sociologist at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And in addition, this FurScience book is the consummation of not just all of our work, but also a few additional folks. Dr. Thomas Brooks is our resident sexologist. He's also down at the table, so if you've got a whole bunch of sex questions and you want to ask a sex researcher, he's literally the guy you want to talk to, right? I'm a social psychologist. I'm just going to point to him and say he's the sex guy. Dr. Francis H.I. Henry is our historian. Anna R. Henry is another sociology major who has helped us with the book as well. Joe Strikes, some of you may be familiar with Joe Strikes' work, published the book Furry Planet, was very instrumental in helping us write a furry history chapter. And I apologize in advance. I knew this slide was going to make me cry in front of like 200 people. The editor of our book, Camille Adams, a good friend of mine, also edited the book and basically took all of my shit writing and made it good. We were at Nordic FuzzCon a couple of weeks ago doing research there, and she didn't come back. So, rest in power, Kiri, wherever you are. Sorry. She'd be laughing right now if she saw me doing this. Losing my shit in front of a bunch of people. So she was instrumental in helping us with writing the book, and definitely it is what it is today because of her. So we're thankful to have had her on the team. Kind of hard to transition out of that one, but we'll do it for science. In addition to the authors of the book, we have some additional folks who've been instrumental in giving us criticism and feedback on the book. Dr. Bobby Zaman, fantastic social work, sociology background, an excellent critic of our work, helping us to sharpen our methodologies, always be asking ourselves, is this the best way we could be doing this? A furry by the name of Yerf runs a website, Yerfology, published an excellent treatise on furries called On Furry, appropriately enough, which has also been an excellent critique of some of our work. Dr. Mel, some of you may be familiar with Dr. Mel, especially if you went to Further Confusion or Anthrocon. Dr. Mel typically makes her way out there. Another fantastic furry scholar. And I sort of say on the shoulders of giants here because I never want to give the impression that we started this whole endeavor. There were furries who came before us doing furry research, furries like David Rust or Sylvan, who back in 1998 ran the first, what they call the Furry Sociological Survey, so just sort of trying to poll the furry fandom and learn a bit about them. That was replicated back in 2008 by Evans. Some of you may know about Tesora and Macchio, who also ran the furry survey through adjective species for a number of years. We've worked with them in the past, and they've been very influential on our work. I couldn't go through an entire list of all the scholars we're building upon today. Fortunately, YURF has a fantastic website there where they go through and has scoured basically every literature out there to find other people who published on the subject of furry in any field. So please check that out. And I want to give a big shout out to the Canadian government, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, because they gave us a lot of money to do this research. Canadian taxpayer dollars at work. So, all right, so what the heck are we? What is this thing called FurScience? So we are a team of social scientists who study furries scientifically, appropriately enough. We've been doing this I guess we've been coming to Furry Fiesta since 2011, so we've been doing this for a while. We've conducted over 50 separate studies at conventions, online, experiments, cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies. We studied more than 30,000 furries from more than 70 different countries in our studies, so it is a lot of data we're talking about here. We didn't just go to the end of the bar and ask the first furry who would talk to us. We take all this data and we don't just hoard it for ourselves. We believe that knowledge should be free. So we publish this stuff in peer-reviewed journals and then bypass the paywalls to distribute those journals to everyone. We run our FurScience website where all of our results are made available. And we publish books like our book FurScience, which is now available for free. You can download it for free at furscience.com. It is 798 pages long, which is 2 pages under the longest limit that we could get away with on Amazon. You can also buy it on Amazon if you want a 3.5-pound brick to bludgeon someone to death. I think it's like $17. It's just the print cost. We don't make any money off of it. So buy from Amazon or pirate or download it straight from us. We don't care. We just want the data to get out there. And yes, so to sort of show our work, this is where the data come from. Lots and lots and lots of different furry conventions over the years. So this isn't just one study from one convention one time. We're definitely building this over years and years of work. Also, for those taking pictures, you're welcome to. If you want a copy of the slide deck, just email me. You can go to FurScience, find my email address, just email me and I will send you the entire slide deck. So, but if you want to take pictures, that's cool too. A last little caveat I want to say before we start. Our perspective at FurScience is just one perspective. We don't want to claim we have all the knowledge on the subject, right? We are coming at this from one particular theoretical perspective. Other perspectives are valid, right? A person who works in media studies may have an entirely different perspective, and that's a perfectly valid perspective. We are not the right holders to the monopoly on all furry knowledge. I never want to give that impression. Our perspective tends to focus on aggregated data, so we tend to focus on what is average, what is typical in the furry fandom. If you look at these findings and say, well, that doesn't describe me, that's perfectly fine. That is valid. We're just talking about what's average or typical, realizing that nuance sometimes gets lost along the way. Also, I want to assure you that these data have been simplified. I promise you, I know how to do a t-test. I know how to run an ANOVA. The nerds and the scientists in the room will come up to me afterwards and be like, way to present averages. Like, do you even know how a t-test works? I promise you, everything in the book has statistics behind it to back it up. But no one here really gives a shit about my ability to do a structural equation model, so I've spared you the gory details. Trust me though, I'm the stats guy. We can talk about stats afterwards if you'd really like. And finally, we do appreciate the questions we get after talks like these, and when furries come up to us at our table, because many of our best ideas come from furries like you giving us suggestions. So please, if you have suggestions, come up to us, talk to us tomorrow after the talk today. We'd love to hear it because, again, some of the coolest findings are going to be here came from some furry in the audience like you going, yeah, but what about this? So yes, we encourage that. Okay, enough preamble. You're all here to get to the data. So let's get to the data. Enough teasing. So we're going to run through this sort of chronologically through the textbook, as if you're as if you're running through the chapters of the book. So we'll start with the basics and work our way through because I realize some folks are pretty new to this. So let's start with the absolute basics. What the heck is a furry? And as it turns out, the old adage that if you ask 10 furries for a definition, you get 11 answers, that's true. So rather than trying to come up with a perfect definition, we asked furries, what is a furry to you? And gave them an empty box. And what we found out was furries can't agree. So yeah, you can see here some things emerged fairly commonly. So 45% of people spontaneously called it a fandom, a community, a group. That was perhaps the single most commonly stated item. Many people spontaneously said it's an interest in furry animals, anthropomorphic animal characters. But you can see it's a lot of things to a lot of different folks. It's inspiration and self-expression. It's art. It's an LGBTQ safe space. It's a form of wish fulfillment, etc., etc. So it's a lot of different things to a lot of folks. So I couldn't possibly give you a definition that everyone in this room would agree with, and that's fine. So now let me give you a definition that we're going to work from. When we publish in journals, they want us to give them something. So this is the perspective we work from as psychologists who study fan groups. We realize it's a lot of other things, but for our purposes, we frame it as a fan group. So we consider furries to be fans of media featuring walking, talking, anthropomorphized animal characters. Now you might say to yourself, well, hold on, my grandmother liked that Zootopia movie. Does that make my grandmother a furry? That would be awesome. However, not necessarily. We say that it's something that you like enough that it becomes part of how you define yourself, right? So I would never walk up to someone and say, hey, I'm Courtney Plante, chocolate lover. Do I like chocolate? Absolutely, I like chocolates. However, when I introduce myself as chocolate lover, people will make some inferences about me. They're going to hear that and say, well, okay, he likes chocolate enough that, like, this is a big part of who he is, right? So that's kind of what it means to be a furry. You don't just like this stuff, you like it enough that's part of who you are. It affects who you hang out with, what you do with your spare time, that sort of thing. And it happens to be based around a particular type of media content. So that's our definition. Now when we talk about furry content, what exactly do we mean? As it turns out, there's a lot of different kinds of furry content out there, right? So for some of you, your interest might be primarily in a particular show, a particular video game, a particular board game, a comic book, a webcomic, a musician, a podcast. A lot of stuff counts as furry media, right? So think big. It's not just Disney movies, I promise you. That rabbit hole goes so much deeper than that. When we ask furries, why do you like this stuff? What is it about? Because that's one of the common questions we get. Like, why don't you just like a normal thing, like sports or Survivor or whatever the people watch these days? I'm showing my age with that one. So we ask furries, well, why do you like this stuff? And again, there's no one reason, but there's a lot of reasons furries state that they kind of agree with. It's got appealing characters, slap some ears and a tail on the character, and it's suddenly more compelling to us. It's creativity. It involves loving animals in general, liking the beauty or the aesthetics of it. It's cute. The idea or concept is interesting, right? I can turn on the TV and see human characters everywhere, but furry characters are rarer, right? So there's a lot of things drawing people to furry content, not just any one particular facet. Yeah, come on in. For the folks who are standing in the back, come on in. Feel free to find a space. When we ask furries, well, okay, but what kind of content do you like? Where do you find this stuff? What do you spend your time consuming? And you can see here, it's a lot of stuff. We in fact compare furries to anime fans in this regard and see that furries aren't so different, right? For example, furries and anime fans both love consuming official merchandise, right? Anime fans may have a particular series they like from a particular studio. Furries may like Disney movies, or they might like some movie or show from some official company. Where you'll see a big difference between furries and anime fans, however, is this consumption of fan-made content. Anime fans definitely love their fan-made content, but furries really love that stuff because a big chunk of our fandom is centered around small independent content creators, right? There's no single entity that has the monopoly on all furry content. We're a cottage industry of lots of tiny little content creators. So furries perhaps are distinct from other fandoms by being this decentralized in the thing that we like, right? Go to the dealer's den, there are literally hundreds of small independent content creators there. So when we ask furries, well, do you prefer official stuff? Do you prefer fan-made stuff? There's no strong preference one way or another. Furries just kind of like furry content, regardless of who makes it. Furries like it a lot, and they spend a lot on it. As it turns out, spend enough time in this fandom, and you'll drop a few $1,000s on it eventually, which, by the way, is not uncommon for any fan interest, right? People who'll spend $500 on tickets to go see a Bruce Springsteen concert or whatever, right? Whatever boomers like. But you can see, so furry conventions, right? So the average furry has spent about $2,700 American on furry conventions, right? Some of you are doing that this weekend as we speak. Fursuits, very commonly, fursuits cost thousands of dollars. We'll talk more about that. Digital art, furry art, you'll see furries spend a lot of money on a lot of different stuff. So there's no one thing that furries like to buy, but they buy a lot of stuff. In fact, most furries, over the course of their career in the fandom, will commission art at least once. So the majority of furries have commissioned art at least a few times. About 80% of furries have commissioned art. So many of you, I imagine, are going to the dealer's den and commissioning someone, perhaps for the first time. Good on you for supporting small local artists. In terms of where you go to commission artists, you'll see here that furry conventions are one of the biggest places. But online, Fur Affinity, a little website you might have heard about. A lot of furry artists get their commissions through there. Twitter, another very popular place for furries to commission. I want to make a special note about Twitter, because some of you maybe remember a little movement called the #TweetFur movement. Some of you know and the rest don't know what this is. So a few years ago, Twitter, back when it was still called Twitter, made an announcement to its users. It said, please don't anthropomorphize the little Twitter bird, please.
Yeah.
Now there's a little something called psychological reactance, which means if you tell someone not to do something, so yeah, furries use Twitter is the point. All right, furries also consume their media in other forms. VR chat was something that came onto the scene for us relatively recently. I'm not a VR chat user myself, so this one was kind of a blind spot until a few furries kind of elbowed me and said, hey, you should stop being old and figure out what this VR chat thing is all about. And so I thought, how many furries can use that? So I threw a survey out there, and it turns out it's about 1/3 of furries. So, oops. So yes, furries use VR chat, and in fact, VR chat users are a little bit different. They tend to be a little bit younger compared to the rest of the fandom, but they're no less furry than anyone else. There's this belief that, oh, if you don't come out to conventions, you're not a real furry. As it turns out, that doesn't hold any water. They are just as furry as anyone else. It's like saying, oh, you're a diehard sports fan. You watch the game every weekend, but you haven't gone to a game in person. You're not a real sports fan. That would be very offensive to a lot of sports fans, right? So how your interest manifests is less important than what it means to you, right? It's not about buying the right suit or going to conventions, right? Your interest manifests the way it does. We also find that VR chat users are more likely to use the fandom as a source of social support, right? For escapism, to help them figure out questions about who they are. They're also more likely to be protogens. So we're free. So 10%, by the way, of VR chat users are protogens. I'm often asked, one of the most common questions we get from furries is, can you tell something about a person from their persona species? And my answer is almost always not really. We haven't found any really strong trends until this. This is, protogens tell us something about a person. That's one of the few things we can infer about a person from that. All right, so we mentioned that furries spend a lot on furry content. Why? Why would you spend all this money on furry content? And so we asked for various reasons. And again, there's no one reason, but one thing that is positive is that it doesn't seem to be like something they feel compelled or forced or strong-armed into doing, right? A lot of furries say, well, I do it because I like it. It feels good to own the things that I like. I like surrounding my space with the stuff that I like, in the way that a sport fan might, cover their walls with pictures of their favorite athletes, right? Well, I like this particular character, so I'm going to put him on my wall. I obviously like the show Owl House, and a friend of mine, I don't know if they're in here right now, but they bought me a lovely poster, which I'm going to go home and put in my room because Owl House kicks ass. We also find that in addition to consuming a lot of content, furries produce a lot of content. So we asked furries over the years, are you a content creator? Are you an artist specifically? And you'll notice that about 1/3 to 40% of furries say yes. Not everyone makes their living doing it, but a lot of furries have tried their hand at doing some kind of visual art. Writing, are you a writer? Again, we see that about 20 to 30% of furries do some form of writing. Not everyone is a Kyle Gold and then makes their living writing books, but a lot of folks have tried their hand at doing a little bit of writing. Musicians, about 15 to 20% of furries consider themselves to be musicians of some sort. You'll notice that every evening at a furry con like this one, there is a lineup of fantastic DJs putting out some amazing music. If it's your first convention, absolutely check out the dances. They are incredible. So this fandom loves its music. We love our content creators. Okay, let's talk about attitudes towards animals and this idea of identifying as animals, because this is something that comes up a lot when the media asks us about furries. Are these people who think they're animals? Are they blurring the line between fantasy and reality? What's the deal? So first of all, furries like anthropomorphized animals, but it's kind of specific to animals, right? So people say, well, okay, furries anthropomorphized animals, but when you turn on your computer, do you talk to it? When you go to the fridge, do you talk to it? Are they seeing humans everywhere? And the answer is not really, right? It tends to be quite specific to animals and plush animals, and maybe robots a bit, because we're kind of tech junkies. But for the most part, furries tend to be quite specifically anthropomorphizing animals. That's the thing they're a fan of. So what's the deal with therians? So some of you may not have heard the term therian before. I always love doing this panel because inevitably I'll explain the term therian and I'll have at least one person come up to me afterwards and say, holy shit, I was a therian. I didn't even realize that was a thing. So we'll see if we have that moment here. But furry is a person who is a fan. You are a fan of walking, talking animal characters. Therians, on the other hand, wouldn't describe them as a fan of this necessarily. To Therians, they would say there's something not entirely human about myself, whether it's spiritual, whether it's psychological. Something about me doesn't feel entirely human. It feels like I've got the spirit of a wolf trapped in a human body, or I feel very much out of touch with being a human, like I'm playing human at work. When I go home, something inside me feels much more animalistic, right? As it turns out, depending on the sample we look at, between about 4 and 16% of furries identify as therians. Now you can be a therian and a furry, this is entirely possible, but it wouldn't be correct to say that most furries are therians, right? And a lot of therians might be offended at the implication of being a furry. They would say, no, I'm not I'm not a fan of this stuff. This is part of who I am. This is a deep and meaningful spiritual experience for me, right? And again, about 1/3 of furrians are like, what the hell is a therian? There's also a group of furries who consider themselves to be otherkin. That's an entire separate conversation, the distinction between therian and otherkin. But think very similar to therianthropy there. So, when we ask furries and therians to describe what is a furry, what is a therian, you see the differences emerge in their answers. So we actually did a lexical analysis where we took all of their open-ended answers and we had a computer pull out some of the most common words. And for furry, the most common words were anthro, fan, fandom, enjoyment, cartoon, right? This is a thing they like. Whereas for therianthropy, none of those words appeared even once, right? Fan or anthro, enjoyment, cartoon, that wasn't the words that they were using to describe therianthropy. Instead, the word spirit came up a lot, right? Spirit, spirituality. This is for many therians a deeply spiritual experience, not something I'm a fan of, but part of who I am. So that's the distinction there. You want to make sure you're not conflating the two. And to illustrate why you don't want to conflate the two, this isn't just being pedantic here. It matters depending on the question you ask. Right? So, for example, we've asked before, hey, do you ever feel not entirely human? And about 1/3 of furries say yeah. They say, yeah, sometimes I have a little too much to drink and, I don't feel entirely human the next day. But when you ask therians, 86% of them say yes to this. So for questions like this, it really matters whether you're talking about therians or talking about furries. This is a difference that makes a difference quantitatively. All right. Let's talk about personas. We've gone this long talking about furries and haven't even mentioned a fursona. So what the heck is a fursona? A fursona is an anthropomorphized animal avatar or representation of yourself. It's a character you use to represent yourself. However, that's just a definition I'm giving you here. When we asked furries what is a fursona, you'll notice, once again, furries couldn't agree on anything. So some things emerged more commonly. So the most common theme was, well, it's me. It's like a similar kind of version of me. But also it's an avatar, it's a mascot, it's a person I play online. Many said it's an idealized version of me. It's a way that I interact with the fandom. But it's a lot of different things for people. For some it's an alter ego. For some it's a coping strategy, right? There's no one right way to have a persona. It means different things to different people. So anyone who's giving a blanket explanation for what a persona is probably going to be oversimplifying and creating boxes and leaving out some important nuance there. We do know that most furries have a persona. About 94% of furries say they have a persona. So if there's any one thing that unites this fandom, having a persona might be the closest thing we can find, right? There's not many things that are this common in the furry fandom. And even then, 6% of furries would disagree with this. We find that about 1/3 to 1/2 of furries say they've only ever had one persona. This is my persona. It's never changed. I've never wavered from it. It's always been this. Which means by extension, right, about 1/2 to 2/3 of furries have or currently have more than one persona. The average number of personas that a furry has had mathematically is 2.3, right? Now, we find that there is no correlation between how many personas you've had and how attached you feel. Some people think, well, if you've had a lot of personas, it must mean you're not very closely attached to any of them. And that's not true. The data don't seem to bear that out. Whether you have one persona or 10 personas, furries tend to feel about the same amount of attachment to them. The average persona has been around for about 5 to 7 years. So when there is a change of persona, oftentimes it's in this slow serial fashion. So for some furries, they'll have a persona for a while, and they'll say, you know, I picked this persona when I got into the fandom at 17, but you know, I'm 30 now, and I don't really feel like the same person anymore, so I'm gonna change up my persona. In other cases, furries with multiple personas have them simultaneously. They'll say, well, I can't represent myself with just one persona, so I've got one that represents my masculine side and one that represents my feminine side, or I've got one that represents my positive side and my negative side, or one that represents one part of me and another part of me. So sometimes it's a form of expressing different facets of oneself. In terms of persona species, it's kind of small, the text here, but you can see here, year after year, fairly consistently, wolves tend to be the most common persona species at about 19%. So statistically speaking, about 1 in 5 people in this room is a wolf. Going down the list, we see most of the species you'd expect to see. If I asked you to close your eyes and guess, you'd see foxes, dragons, dogs, house cats, tigers, shapeshifters, deers, rabbits, hyenas, lions, bears, etc. They're all sort of represented here. The problem with doing this is that no matter how I organize and cluster this, someone will get really angry with me afterwards and say, I can't believe you lumped mouse and rats together, you monster. So I do this knowing full well that someone is going to be very upset with me because I've lumped something together, right? How dare you put snow leopards separate from the rest of the big cats or whatever. All right, one question I get asked is why these species? Why do wolves and foxes and cats and dogs emerge so commonly? And again, there's no one right reason, because there's no one path into a person's persona. People develop their personas for a wide range of reasons. What we do suggest, though, is that this probably isn't a coincidence that these species emerge the most commonly. We think that when you pick a persona, right, you use the language you're most familiar with, the species that you have the most tropes associated with. So dragons, wolves, foxes. We have a very rich literature in our culture, in our society, historically, of telling stories that embody these species. Cats and dogs, well, most people have had a cat or a dog in their life. So these are the species you tend to know the best. So we think that's why those ones tend to emerge most commonly. When we talk about anthropomorphization, we've asked furries, is your persona basically just a dog, or is it like an anthropomorphized dog? And what we find is that, again, furries tend to lean more towards the anthropomorphized side of the scale. Very few furries will say, my persona is literally just a dog. Right? So it's again reinforcing this idea that it's anthropomorphism. That's the big draw here. We have asked furries, hey, your persona is deep and meaningful to you. Would you be bothered if, like, someone were to take elements of your persona from you and inspire their own with it? Does it bother you if you came up with a neat species and someone else took inspiration from that species? And what we tend to find is that most furries tend to create their own personas from scratch, and furries tend to not really try to take too much from other persona species. We do find that furries are often very flattered, though, if someone were to draw inspiration. As long as you're not like shamelessly stealing details from someone else's persona, usually furries are pretty cool about it. Furries like their species and like seeing other people with their species. When we ask furries, is your persona similar to you? Right? What we tend to find on a 7-point scale is that, yeah, furries overwhelmingly say that my persona is very similar to me. My persona is basically me or very similar to me, but also it's actually who I am. So it's similar to me, it's very similar to who I actually am, but it's also an idealized version of me. So my persona is this complex mix of who I am currently, but also who I'd like to be. So for many furries, they'll say my persona is like me, but a taller, faster, smarter, stronger, better looking, more confident version of me. Right? So it's me, if I could make some small tweaks, this is the person I'd want to be. And again, I'm speaking in generalizations. There's some percentage of furries who say, not at all, my persona is like the opposite of me. It's my alter ego. So I don't want to cover everyone with the same brush, but that tends to be the common trend. Personas allow us to become something we'd like to be. If we get to play in a fantasy space here, why not be exactly what you wish you could be? When we ask furries, hey, this persona that you've created, when does it come out? Does it only come out when you're hanging out with other furries? Do you introduce to your coworkers to your personas? We tend to find that furries mostly interact with other furries as their persona. But when it comes to daily life, furries tend to do just the opposite, right? So very few furries will introduce themselves to their coworkers or to random people in their streets as their persona. Again, not every furry, but for many furries, this is the case. Are there stereotypes about particular species? So there are stereotypes about, oh, you know what X species is like, and so we've been asked over the years to test some of these. And what we find, of the ones we tested, about half of them hold a little bit of empirical water, right? We found, for example, that people whose persona species is a wolf actually are more likely to describe themselves and their own personalities as being centered around things like loyalty. Foxes are more likely to describe themselves as being sly and cunning and kind of clever. So you would say, aha, obviously this is evidence that persona species stereotypes are true. But a lot of ones do not hold water as well. For example, there is a stereotype about foxes as being promiscuous. This doesn't hold any empirical water. There's no evidence that this is true. So some of these stereotypes, despite the fact that they're very commonly held, they actually don't predict anything about a person. And even when they do, they're very, very, very tiny effects. And this is partly because there's no one reason why a person picks their persona species. You could pick wolf because you consider yourself to be a loyal person, or you could pick it because you saw a wolf at the zoo one time and thought they were kind of neat, right? What we do know is that people tend to assume that when I learn about someone's persona species, that tells me something about someone, right? So regardless of the stereotypes, if you meet a person who's a cat, you say, okay, now that I know you're a cat, that gives me some insight into your psyche. We also find that people tend to think that whatever your persona species is, it happens to be the best one, and you like other people who have that species. So I'm here to tell you you're right. Whatever your species is, that's the best one. All right. My favorite picture in the whole slide deck. All right. Let's talk about fursuits. So, we're going to talk about fursuits because the media absolutely loves to talk about fursuits. Whenever the media does a story about furries, they show some fursuits and say, furries, you know, those weirdos who wear the fursuits. So let's talk about that. Do furries wear fursuits? I want to make the argument that fursuits are probably the most visually iconic part of the furry fandom. Meaning if you go to a person and say, close your eyes and picture a furry, they're going to imagine someone in the fursuits. In the same way that if I said, picture a sports fan, you'd picture someone wearing a team jersey or maybe painting their face. If I said, picture a Star Wars fan, you're going to picture a person wearing stormtrooper outfits or running around with a lightsaber, right? These aren't necessarily the most common ways of expressing your interest, but they are quite visually distinct, so they pop out in our minds. When you actually look at the statistics, about 1/3 of furries that we sample online, and about 41% of convention-going furries has a fursuit, which means, by extension, more than half of furries do not own a fursuit. So if you're describing furries as people who wear fursuits, you are describing furries by a minority of furries. This is statistically incorrect. Having a fursuit is not what makes you a furry. It doesn't even make you more furry necessarily. We do know that fursuits are popular and ownership is increasing. For example, at Anthrocon in 2010, 16.8% of the attendees at Anthrocon in 2010 were wearing a fursuit in the fursuit parade. By 2022, that number had jumped to 26.4%, right? Meaning more and more furries, especially younger furries, are choosing to express their interest in fursuits, or may even have gotten into the fandom in the first place because they like the fursuits. So when we ask furries, do you want to own a fursuit? A lot of them say yes. That doesn't mean that every furry wants to own one, though. In the same way, if you're a sports fan, would you like to have a jersey of your favorite player? Okay, sure. Are you going to go out and buy one? Maybe not. Maybe that's not your first financial decision. And again, some folks just don't want that. Okay, cost. So this is some data that was given to us by Abigail Turbatian, who collected a whole bunch of data on fursuit makers. And what you can see here is that the average fursuit is expensive. That's the conclusion here. So we can see sort of the minimum cost out of 109 separate makers. We can see the minimum cost, the maximum cost out of those 109, and then the mean costs, right? So the average fursuit head alone costs about $1,000, right? The average partial suit is pushing close to $2,000. By the time you get into plantigrade suits and digitigrade suits being the fancy ones with all the padding that give the illusion of the digitigrade legs, we're talking about $3,000 on average for that. That's expensive. That's a really expensive investment for one's fan interest, which is why a lot of furries might not have a fursuit or want a fursuit. For some, that's a lot of money that just isn't how they want to manifest that interest. Maybe they'd rather just watch some shows or draw some art or just hang out with other furries and nerd out about furry stuff. In fact, you can't really define furries by any type of clothing or product owned. When we ask furries, hey, what about tails? Are furries people who own tails? Only 48% of furries owns a tail, which again means most furries do not own a tail, right? So you can't define furries by what they're wearing, or they're not people who wear collars or have furry t-shirts or little ears and stuff. That's not what makes the furry the furry. Okay. This one is really important. I want to emphasize this slide here. This goes out to a lot of the younger furries here. I can remember being a young furry going to my first furry convention, and there's a tremendous amount of pressure on you to get a fursuit. You look around and you see all the other fursuits and say, man, I can't wait till I get my first fursuit. And they obsess about it and they think about it, right? Once I have that fursuit, I'll be a real furry and everyone will recognize that I'm a real furry. And I want to caution you against that insecurity. Because a lot of furries say, well, when I get that fursuit, I'm going to wear it all the time. I'm gonna wear it every week, and everyone's going to see how furry I am, and it's going to be amazing. And when you actually study fursuit owners, you find the average fursuit owner, when they were wearing it at their peak, only wore it maybe once a month, less than once per month. So if you're talking about at the age of 19 or 20, dropping $3,000 to get a fursuit that you're only going to wear for maybe once a month, once every other month, a few times a year, keep in mind, it's not necessarily going to change your life, right? Be judicious and make good financial decisions. And perhaps ask yourself, do I need this right now? Or is that an insecurity that I'm creating for myself? And for the rest of the fandom, we could probably do a better job in helping people to not feel insecure if they don't have a fursuit, and to recognizing, hey, the fursuit isn't what makes you the furry. I think that would help a lot of younger furries not feel this peer pressure to have to go out and spend the amount of a used car on a fursuit. All right, so for those who do have fursuits, what compels you to wear the fursuit? And again, there's no one reason, but several emerged quite commonly. Creativity, it's a form of self-expression. It's fun, I get to entertain others. I get to feel a little different. I get to display a different side of myself. It's a way to connect to the fandom. There's lots of reasons to wear a fursuit, right? When we asked for it, do you behave differently when you're in your fursuit? Most said yes. As a person who wears a fursuit myself, I can tell you, when I'm walking around my university campus in fursuit, which I do sometimes, I can tell you I'm a lot more bold in my fursuit, right? In my fursuit, I'll walk into a random class and mess around with the teacher. I wouldn't dare do that without my fursuit on. Also, if I didn't have tenure. So we asked fursuiters. Most agree it's easier to meet other people in fursuits. So when you're at a furry convention, a lot of fursuiters will say, I'm a really shy person. I'm a socially awkward person. But when I put on my fursuit, I can walk up and meet people and make friends. So for many of them, this is that way of kind of helping with the social anxiety and helping them to reach out and find that connection between folks. Many of them say, I feel more accepted when I'm in suits. So a lot of furries say, look, I'm a socially awkward person. Maybe people wouldn't like me very much, but when I put on the suit that's cute and lovable, people give me the positive attention that I'm trying to find. So again, keep in mind for some folks, this fursuit may be the only way that they're able to have positive social interactions. And maybe the fursuit allows them to sort of have this little crutch to say, okay, I'm getting some practice with positive social interaction. And maybe if I make some friends that way, next time I don't have to wear the suit to go out and meet people. All right, let's talk about some demographics, some numbers and some average tendencies in this fandom. This one is age. I put this here because I definitely feel this as an aging furry in this fandom. This is that moment where I turn to dust and blow away, because this is the age distribution of the fandom. I won't point to where I am, but I'm definitely to the right side of this figure here, and getting righter with each year. Now notice we cut it off at 18. That's because our ethics board doesn't allow us to study minors, but I assure you this line goes up as you, if you include minors. So a significant chunk of this fandom is in their mid to late teens, about to make their way onto this figure. We can, even if we can't directly study minors, we can ask furries in our surveys, hey, when did you get into the fandom? And a surprising amount of furries were getting into this thing for the first time in their mid to late teens. So when you have a convention, for example, it's 18 plus, please keep in mind, you are leaving a lot of furries out of the mix, right? There may be perfectly good reasons to do so, but keep in mind that there's a lot of furries who are left out when you have 18 plus events, right? Let's not cut off 30 or 40% of our fandom by doing that all the time. Also, we find that the average furry first starts calling themselves a furry at around the age of 16 or 17. That's probably going down with each passing year as furries discover the fandom sooner and sooner through things like TikTok, right? Back in my day, we didn't have TikTok. You had to find furries by stumbling into an art gallery somewhere online. Gray muzzles. Some have heard of the term gray muzzle. Gray muzzle is a term that's often used to refer to older furries. About 9 to 14% of furries, myself included, will use the term to describe themselves. The average gray muzzle is between the ages 36 and 43. We have had 18-year-olds call themselves gray muzzles. So take this with a grain of salt. The oldest 18-year-old furry I've ever seen. We've asked furries, what year did you join the fandom? And you can see here, there's little peaks and valleys here. A lot of furries have joined the fandom relatively recently. You'll notice there's a 2020, there's
I think it's
strange thing happened in 2020. I wonder what. Furries with a lot of free time, and this program called VR Chat came onto the scene. I wonder if maybe that had something to do with it. So, this is one of my favorite figures, and it takes a moment to explain, but it's worth the wait. Okay, so we are comparing here data we've collected on furries, on bronies, My Little Pony fans, and anime fans. And this is basically, with each passing year, how old is the average fan? And we're going to tell the story in 3 parts. Part 1, bronies, this line right here. So bronies. For those who don't know, there was a show, My Little Pony, that came onto the scene. And a lot of folks got onto it in their late teens, early 20s. A lot of, let's not split hairs, 4chaners and people online. They got onto the My Little Pony train. And they continued riding that My Little Pony train. And what's happening here is as each year goes by, they're getting older and older. But there's not an influx of younger fans, right? 5 years into the show, you weren't just discovering the show. You either got on that train or you weren't getting on that train. So what we see here is the same group of folks slowly getting older and older with their fandom. This is what it looks like when there's not a lot of young blood coming in, suppressing the age. Now look at anime fans by comparison, right? What you see is over a 10-year period, the average anime fan didn't get any older, right? They're not defying the laws of physics. There's a whole bunch of up-and-coming young anime fans pouring in, constantly suppressing the average age, keeping it lower, right? So that's what it looks like when there's tons of young fans coming in, sort of drowning out the older fans, kind of making them get buried under the data. So here's what furries look like. Kind of in between the two, right? On the one hand, furries are getting older as a group, right? So we can see here that there are furries in this room who've been in this fandom for 10, 15, 20, 30 years perhaps, right? They're still here. But also there's a lot of younger furries coming in as well. So it's sort of the middle ground between the two. The fandom as a whole is getting older, but there's also this influx of younger furries keeping the average age rather low. So this isn't an aging fandom, but it's also not a fandom of just young people. It's a little mix of both. All right, educational attainment. Let's change gears entirely, continuing to talk about demographics. Furries like college. Most furries like education. You can see here that most furries statistically are currently in college or have achieved a college degree. Furries are kind of nerdy in that regard. In fact, if you look at the grades of the average furry, as a professor, I wish I had this kind of distribution of grades in my class. So furries are kind of nerdy, right? Not every furry, of course, but a lot of furries tend to do pretty well in school and kind of nerdy. In terms of socioeconomic status, right? We tend to find that furries tend to be kind of in the not wealthy enough to strike out on their own range. There are definitely wealthy furries and suspiciously wealthy furries. But for the most part, a lot of furries are kind of in this range right here. The average furry makes about $30,000 a year, US. Right? Now, that goes up with each year. We think this is a product of furries being relatively young and relatively college going. When you're a 19-year-old furry, you're probably not making $80K a year, right? In fact, when we ask furries, what is your job? The most common answer is student, right? Which is going to suppress the average income of furries by quite a bit. Furries will eventually start to make more money and be able to strike out on their own. But for a lot of furries who are going to college or have aspirations to go to college, it's rough. The economy is rough out there. That's just the reality for young people. This is also reflected in the living accommodations data. There's this misconception, furries are all people who live in their parents' basement. And yeah, okay, that's kind of true. However, that's not a furry thing. We've seen the same thing in anime fans. We've seen the same thing in bronies. We've seen the same thing in young sports fans. Turns out if you're a young person going to college, moving out and getting your own house is really hard, right? And in fact, for furries who are over the age of 24, we see that rate drop considerably because now they can start to afford to live on their own. They're starting to graduate college. They're starting a career at this point, right? So this misconception of furries as maladjusted, not being able to live in the real world, that's a product of just being a young person trying to survive in the economy we've got today. Family composition. So we've been asked before, do furries come from broken families? There's this belief that furries are weird and we have to explain that weirdness. So something must have gone wrong at home. Our data suggests that furries aren't likely to have come from families with divorced parents. That was one belief. The parents got divorced and furries were treated into fantasy to cope. That doesn't seem to have any bearing. The data don't bear that out. Furries, right, aren't more likely to be single children or anything like that. My favorite finding so far, the whole bunch, is that when there is more than one sibling involved, furries are significantly more likely to be the older sibling rather than the younger sibling.
Yeah.
We're debating on why that is. We got a lot of hypotheses. We're still working through it. I've heard some compelling ones, but this is still an unanswered question.
Why?
All right, let's talk about relationship status. Again, there's this belief that furries are single and lonely and miserable because that's this portrayal of a nerd that people often show online. As it turns out, about half of furries, 1/3 to 1/2 of furries, are currently not dating, which means by extension, a lot of furries are in fact dating or engaged or married. We also see that rates of polyamory are considerably higher than what you find in the general population. Of those who are in relationships, about 77% of furries are dating another furry. So if you're a furry, there's a good likelihood that your partner is also furry. In fact, many of those folks say that they found their partner through the fandom itself. In fact, only about 11% say that, well, I'm a furry because my partner dragged me into it. And only about 17 to 18% say that their partner is not a furry. Another one of my favorite findings is if you are attracted to men, the fandom is a target-rich environment. So if you're attracted to men, you are more likely to find your significant other in the fandom. If you're attracted to women, go find a nice anime fan and drag them into the furry fandom. All right, on the subject of furry relationships, this is a confusing figure. I'll walk you through it. We compared furries and Star Wars fans and said, is your fan interest contributing to your relationship, or is it hurting the relationship? What we found with furries is that overwhelmingly, they said, my partner being a furry and my being a furry, this really helps our relationship, right? Star Wars fans said, has no effects, right? So we can see here that being a furry tends to be a net positive, especially if your partner is also a furry. And indeed, sort of counteracting this idea that furries are miserable and can't be in relationships and there's something wrong with them, the vast majority of furries in relationships said they are perfectly happy in their relationship. All right, let's talk about race in the furry fandom. How to make a room go entirely silent. Especially with the white guy standing at the front of the room. So, there's this perception of the furry fandom as this predominantly white space. I've seen this shit on Twitter. People will say, oh, you're black, you can't possibly be a furry. No. Wrong. The data suggests that's wrong. That's not true. And in fact, these numbers are changing with every year, right? If the furry fandom seems predominantly white, that's because you're drawing your sample from a country that is predominantly white, right? So this is not a furry thing. There's nothing about your race that precludes you from being a furry. However, I want to spend a moment, and this work is inspired by Cami. She was really instrumental in pushing us to do more work on BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So we did. And so this work right here is a testament to the work that she did helping to promote this stuff. So to make one comparison, looking between BIPOC folks in the fandom and white folks in the fandom, there's some significant differences here that you'll note. BIPOC folks, about 41% say that they never think about their race in fandom spaces, which means, by extension, most BIPOC folks are thinking about their race in fandom spaces, right? If you walk into a room and you're the only white guy, you notice that shit, right? That's what they're experiencing oftentimes, right? Compared to white furries, most of whom say, I never have to think about the fact that I'm white in white spaces. It just never comes up, right? And that's when you talk about white privilege, this is what it looks like. The fact that you never have to think about what it means to be white in furry spaces. In addition, BIPOC folks will say that, yeah, when their race comes up, it's not always in a good context. It's not always in a positive way. Right? 20% say that it comes up in sort of a negative way. Whereas for white furries, again, very few say that it comes up in a positive way. And for the most part, it's usually in a neutral way. Again, as a white person, I'm very aware of the fact that it's easy for me to talk about this in my own words. So these are some quotes from BIPOC folks in our surveys, just to sort of give some voice to them and let their own words speak for themselves here. So on the subject of negativity in the fandom that they experience, a couple of quotes. I always have to be cognizant of that when engaging in online spaces, but it's especially necessary in furry. Since joining the fandom, I've noticed that many spaces allow and even encourage outright racism. And I was the target of a racist furry who harassed me off the internet for a period of nearly 2 years. Another one, whenever Asians are mentioned in fandom spaces, it's mostly manifested as racist jokes and cultural appropriation, rather than any sort of racism, hate, or attack, or even in any particular positive manner or context. I thus perceive any mention of Asians in the community with some weary skepticism, since many of these instances are in negative contexts and manners, right? But it's not all negative as well. There's a lot of positivity in this fandom as well. So from BIPOC folks as well, I don't really think about it, except when I start seeing other Black creatives in the fandom speaking up. Then I feel mighty proud. Or mostly positive, when I meet fellow Hispanic furs and we chat and joke around in Spanish, or make jokes that only Latin Americans would understand, I feel proud of my roots and culture, and a sense of my belonging is better because of it. Or it's almost exclusively positive. I have a few friends who make OCs based off native tribes and the spirits they worshipped. Seeing the designs and the research that was done to make the OCs accurate makes me feel as though my culture is not dying out. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but we should be mindful of that in this furry fandom and not do shit like say, oh, if you're Black, you can't be here, right? But and not only say, not only acknowledging that, but also calling that shit out when we see it, right? There's that expression, it's not enough to not be racist, but to be anti-racist, right? Make it so that they're not the only folks who feel like they have to step up and say something. Step up and say something and let them know that the majority of people in this fandom are behind them, and a vast majority. A couple of other quotes here. Where does this marginalization come from? What are some of the sorts of things that come up or that have been experienced by BIPOC? Feeling overlooked, feeling ignored, right? Not seeing people who look like them in convention spaces. Microaggressions like hair touching. I shouldn't have to tell you, don't touch another person's hair, right? This is not a person, it's not an animal at the zoo, right? Leave them alone, don't touch them, right? Tolerance of bigotry, right? So allowing racism to go unchecked. When you see it in a forum, when you hear someone make a racist comment, not calling it out is almost as bad as contributing to it, right? If there's silence, it's deafening, and everyone goes, oh, I guess we're just going to allow that to happen. This assumption of whiteness, this assuming that if you're talking to another furry, they must obviously be white, and saying things like, oh, I'm surprised that you're Black, right? Why, right? Let's also talk about sex and gender, and I want to preface this by thanking the furry fandom, because when we first started doing this research 12 or so years ago, we committed the cardinal sin that a lot of social scientists today still commit. We asked, check the box, male or female. And when you do that, you get a very simple answer, and simple answers lack nuance. Simple answers lack important detail. Ever since then, furries have, rightly so, come after us and said, hey, you gotta get better at this. And we did. We took feedback from furries, we went around to LGBTQ organizations and got a lot of feedback from them. And today I'm proud to say, we're much better at the way we ask this question. We ask it in a much more nuanced way. We ask it in an open-ended way and say, hey, what terms do you use? Describe your gender for us, right? And as it turns out, when you start breaking that down, you get a lot more nuance than just male versus female, right? We find, for example, that a significant chunk of the furry fandom is non-binary, is transgender, is genderqueer. This would have been entirely lost if we just said, check the box, male or female. We find that trans furries are about 15 to 20 times more prevalent in the furry fandom than in the general population. That would have been entirely lost if we hadn't been looking for it. So again, thank you to the furry fandom for helping us to get better and better every year in the way we ask these questions. All right, I was told, so this is Cammie's biggest contribution to this entire talk. I don't get this shark thing, but she said, put that on the slide, they'll laugh. So, I think she was right from the sound of it. So, again, I don't get it, but someone can explain it to me afterwards. So, in talking about gender, just like we did with the race stuff, we asked about, okay, well, when your gender does come up, how often does it come up? And when it comes up, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And we find for cis women in fandom spaces, about half say they never think about their gender. Trans people, only 10% say they never think about their gender. And cis men, the vast majority say the fact that they're a guy in fandom spaces never really comes up. Again, this is what privilege looks like. If you never have to think about what it means to be a guy in fandom spaces, if that's just sort of taken for granted, that's what privilege looks like, right? That's a comforting thing to not have to worry about. And you can see here that it's not always good when it comes up, depending on who you're talking to. For cis women, you can see here that it's a pretty mixed bag of good and bad stuff. For trans people, I'm positive to say that 60%, when it comes up, it's in a positive way. This is a net good thing. For cis men, again, kind of a mixed bag, but overwhelmingly it's kind of a neutral thing when it comes up. You never have to think about it. When you do, it's just sort of like, yeah, I'm a dude. So again, we're going to go through, and as a cis guy, I'm very aware of the fact that I have a particular voice here. So to give voice to other folks in our survey, some quotes from them. This is from cis women, and you can see here some negative stuff that comes up that they identified. My gender, female, seems to be less valued than males. This is due to seeing many more popular people being gay and male. I get ignored for being a cis woman a lot. Women are hugely marginalized in the not safe for work sector of furry, including art and mersuiting. It's common to see comments like, ew, vagina, or if only you were a guy. Friends of mine who are fursuiters have been rebuked when the person they were interacting with discovered the person in the costume was a woman. A lot of furry artists only draw men or are only practiced at drawing male characters. Trans folks, similarly, even though it's mostly positive, there's still some negative stuff that creeps through. Stuff like this. As a trans person, I tend to think about my gender a lot. And while the fandom is very LGBTQ friendly, I've seen some transphobic and homophobic furries. So I do worry from time to time about being disrespected. Or this one, when I was first exploring my gender, I used my persona to do so. I take that as a positive, and it helped a lot. However, sometimes there's transphobia and misogyny within the fandom, presenting as fetishization of trans mask folks and a distaste for assigned female at birth people. So again, you can see it's a mixed bag, and it's worth being mindful. If you're a cis guy, it's easy to overlook the fact that this probably doesn't happen to you. So I would encourage you to not turn a blind eye to these sorts of things, and to listen to trans folks and their experience, to listen to women and their experience in this fandom. Again, trans folks, there's some positive stuff too. We mentioned that most of their experiences are positive, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of these. Most of my friends are trans people in the furry fandom, so we feel comfortable talking with one another about gender. This is a community where it just feels normal to be openly queer. And furries tend to be far more aware and respectful of transgender people's pronouns than non-furries, who frequently misgender me despite my having come out to them and despite my obviously male name. Also, because of my male persona, people in the fandom often correctly assume my pronouns are he, him, which is something I rarely get to experience otherwise. So for a lot of trans folks, this is like one of the few places they can find where being trans is respected, where their pronouns are respected. It is a place where they feel safe. Sexual orientation. So this data came up a lot, and I like it because it's very nuanced. There's no one clear story. There's this perception, the fandom is entirely gay, right? The fandom isn't entirely any one thing. It's a huge mixed bag of things, right? No one demographic makes it past the 50% mark. So this fandom is a huge mixed bag of sexual orientation. What we can say is that unlike the general population where being straight is the majority, that's not the case in the furry fandom. It's kind of a mixed bag of everything. Also, shout out to my asexual bros who often get overlooked in the data. You're there, you're visible. Religiosity. How to again make a room go entirely silent. So there's no any real general trend that we found in the furry fandom, except to say that the religious composition of the furry fandom in a particular area is going to reflect the religious composition of that area. If you're in a place that's mostly secular, most furries in that area are going to be secular. If you're in a place that's mostly Christian, you're going to find a lot of Christian furries, right? So for a lot of folks, their religion isn't at odds with their being a furry. What we do tend to find, though, is that furries, even if they are religious, won't necessarily describe themselves as especially religious. They'll say, well, okay, yeah, like, I was raised Christian and I identify as Christian, but like, I don't really go to church, or I'm not like super into it, right? A lot of furries are much more likely to say, well, I'm spiritual. I have tenets of spirituality, or I practice my faith privately in my own way without necessarily going to church or doing a lot of traditional religious stuff. So it might be more accurate to say furries are spiritual, not necessarily religious. Again, if you're religious and furry, that is perfectly valid too. Political ideology. Let's continue on this trend of things that make people uncomfortable to talk about. So, if you were to lay out political ideology from liberal to conservative, there's a slight tendency towards liberalism in the furry fandom. It does not mean that if you're a conservative, you are not present in the fandom. You're just a little bit of a minority in this fandom. Indeed, when we ask furries to just list off terms that describe them, you'll see that some of the more common terms are terms like lefty, liberal, progressive, socialist, centrist. But you will still find other terms there as well. Conservative is there. You'll notice that fascism is low. Not low enough in my opinion. This is a PG-13 panel, so I get one F-bomb. Fuck Nazi first. In terms of political views, what's interesting, because of this political divide in the fandom, or tendency towards being liberal furries tend to be much more comfortable expressing their views. If you're in the majority, you feel quite comfortable saying liberal things and expressing your views. A lot of centrist and conservative furries will say, you know, I kind of keep that to myself because I don't want to antagonize the furries around me. And indeed, when we ask furries straight up, do you ever feel like you're unable to talk about your political views? It's conservatives who feel the least able to talk openly about their political views. Let's talk about drama. Since we've sort of been leading up to that, let's just dive headfirst into drama. As it turns out, you can scientifically define drama. We did it and published a paper on it. So here's the scientific definition of drama as determined by asking a whole bunch of people to define furry drama and extracting the common elements. 3 things emerge. 1, drama involves some kind of a conflict. 2 or more people are fighting about something. Secondly, it's something that gets blown out of proportion, right? This should have been a little thing and is no longer a little thing. And usually it's become a big thing because it's happened in public, it's happened online. Now, just to clarify, not every conflict is drama. If your roommate came after you with a knife and you called the cops, that is not drama. That is a proportionate response to a situation. So I don't want to trivialize or say everything is drama, right? However, if it gets blown out of proportion, that is when you start to get into drama territory. Now, when we ask furries, is drama in the fandom something undesirable? Furries are kind of mixed on this, you'll notice, right? Furries don't say that it's fantastic, but also they won't say it's horrible. Some furries will say, well, drama can be useful for sussing out how the fandom feels about a particular issue. It's a good touch point for furries to kind of see, well, how do we feel as a group about this? And furries on Twitter will tell you how they feel about these things. Just to go through a couple of drama touch points here. Should the fandom be mainstream? Should furries switch and become a mainstream thing? Is it a good thing if more people know about furries? Furries are kind of mixed on this one. They're about twice as likely to want the fandom to become more mainstream than they are to want it to not become mainstream. Many furries saw Zootopia as a good thing, as a way to bring more mainstream attention to being furry. But about 46% of furries also say, I would kind of prefer it to stay underground. I don't necessarily want it to become mainstream entirely, right? About 14% strongly preferred, let's make it more mainstream, right? And there were a lot of mixed feelings in there as well. So again, this is one of those issues you can almost split a room based on their stance towards mainstream or not. Attitudes towards original persona species. So there are some species that were created by a single person, and some of them have sort of propagated and become much more common in the fandom. Species like protogens, species like Dutch angel dragons, right? Where they may have come or may have gone as sort of a trend. How do furries feel towards these species? From 0 to 100, furries are pretty positive. Furries like creativity, so someone comes up with a really neat looking species, cool, I'm here for that. Protogens kick all kinds of ass, I'm here for that. Attitudes towards designer fursuits, the idea of some kind of mainstream fashion brand making fursuits, or the idea of having a brand name fursuits. Furries kind of mixed on this one. You can see that a lot of furries are dead set against it. A lot of furries are kind of okay with it. A lot of furries are really mixed on that one. So again, if you want to split a room, that might be the kind of thing that could cause some drama or some disagreements. Poodling. So for those who don't know, poodling is when you wear fursuits, but you have skin exposed. Maybe you have the head and you have a shirt on and some bare skin and then the paws. This was controversial a few years ago. The fandom has kind of settled in since then and leaned towards the, hey, it's my fursuit, I'll wear it however I want approach. But there's also a bit of a generational divide on this. It tends to be younger furries, or older furries rather, who tend to be a little more opposed to this, who say fursuiting is an art and it should be respected. It's a craft. You don't want to break the magic. You don't want to spoil this, right? A lot of younger fursuiters will say, man, I bought this because I want to wear it around my friends, and when I get hot, I'm popping the head off. I'm not going to dehydrate. Are you a fool? So it's kind of a mixed bag, but we do tend to see generational differences in attitudes towards this, right? We definitely aren't of the same mind on this. Furries will disagree on this. So again, if you want to split a room, here's a good one. What should the fandom be? What ought the fandom to be? Should the fandom be a place for only fun? According to the black bars, furries are all over the place on this one. Should the fandom be politics free? Furries either really disagree or really agree with this idea. Should the fandom be a place for political advocacy? Furries are all over the board on this one. Right? So you can see here, furries don't have a strong tendency towards one side of this issue or another. Furries will disagree very strongly on this issue. Should the fandom accept everyone? Furries are really mixed on this one. Part of the reason behind this is there's nuance in this question that gets lost. Right? So when I say, oh, should the fandom accept everyone? Right? If you say no, people will say, how dare you put up boundaries in this fandom of ours? Everyone should be welcome. Right? And most people agree with this in general, but everyone's got, okay, but what about this group? Everyone's got that, but what about? Right? And so depending on whether you include that here, furries will disagree. I think there's a lot more agreements than disagreements on this issue, and where the drama happens is because we haven't clearly defined what exactly do we mean by this. It's a lot of unnecessary infighting. Specifically, when we ask furries about gatekeeping, again, most furries disagree in concept with the idea of gatekeeping. However, when you ask, how do you feel about excluding specific furries or specific groups of furries, furries go, yeah, okay, there's this one group that, right? So I think we can agree that most furries generally agree this should be an inclusive space. We can agree on that. We'll maybe quibble over the details, but realize we have a lot more in common than disagreements on this issue. Ageism in this fandom. I love this. This was a suggestion to us a few years ago by a furry asking us to look at ageism in the fandom. So the data looked like this. The general tendency with this confusing graph is showing that younger furries prefer to hang out with younger furs. Older furs tend to hang out with older furs. And if you're 30 years old, everyone wants to hang out with you. Yeah. And now, there's some ageism here, some age preference, but I think there's some rationale to this, right? Part of this stems from the fact that older folks and younger folks are just at different places in their life, right? So if you're 20 years old, you're talking about buying your first car, going to college, and how much your first apartment sucks. If you're 45 years old, you're talking about how much your back hurts. You're talking about when you're going to retire someday, if you're going to get to retire someday. You're talking about raising the kids, or you're at very different places in your life. And even the cultural touch points, the shows that you watch, the music you listen to, are in very different places. So it kind of makes sense why there's just fewer points in common that younger furries and older furries can find. This doesn't mean it's impossible for them to hang out, but it just means you're working against some generational divides. Let's talk about furry stigma. Let's talk about furry stigma. So, we've asked non-furries, how do you feel about furries? Oh, sorry, first of all, this one is, how much stigma do furries expect? So, how much do furries think the average person dislikes furries? And you can see, furries feeling some heat here, right? Furries definitely look to the outside world as a bit of a hostile place towards furries. And there's some truth to this idea, I'm afraid. So we've asked anime fans, sports fans, bronies, to rate furries. And then we asked furries, how well do you think those groups rated furries? And what we tended to find is that the average group didn't exactly rate furries high. We scored about 23 out of 100. So not great. We scored significantly lower than anime fans, but hey, people also hate bronies, so there's that. What was kind of sad was that even anime fans, right? About 50% of furries are anime fans, but even anime fans as a group kind of shit on furries. And the sad part is that furries didn't expect them to. Furries were kind of unexpectedly betrayed and thrown under the bus. We said, well, anime fans will stick up for us, and awkward. So we have some research on this idea. One of my favorite papers that my colleague Stephen Rayson and I published looked at something called fan prototypicality. So when I say picture a car, you're probably picturing something with 4 wheels, right? That's what a typical car looks like to you. You have a prototype of what an average car looks like. We do that for everything, an average chair, an average table. As it turns out, we do that for categories of people as well. When I say picture the average fan, person, not an oscillating fan. But when I say picture the average fan, most people are thinking music fans or sports fans or TV fans, right? And what our research has suggested was that furries are seen as a very unusual fan group. We stacked furries up against a whole bunch of other fan groups. And what we found was that furries were down here next to bronies and the insane clown posse in terms of how weird we are. And unfortunately, that weirdness leads to people having unflattering assumptions about furries. What this complicated gobbledygook essentially means is that the more normal or typical a fan group is seen as being, the more comfortable and pleased people are, the more people want to be around those folks, and the more they assume functional, pure, good things about those folks. Right? So if you assume that a group is weird, you go looking for an explanation. What is it with those furries? And furries are weird, so you go looking for a weird explanation. You say, well, maybe it's a sex thing. That's weird. Sex is weird, so it's probably a sex thing. Or, maybe not all their dogs are barking upstairs. So maybe something's not entirely right in their head. But you go looking for an explanation for this unusual interest. And usually the explanation isn't a terribly flattering one. So we think this is where some of that stigma is coming from. When we ask furries, have you been bullied before? Furries, compared to the average person, reports a history of being bullied more. And I'm not just talking about being teased or made fun of, I'm talking about getting your ass kicked, right? You like the wrong hobby, that's a target on your back, right? And so compared to anime fans, compared to sports fans, furries are more likely to play their fan interest close to the chest, right? Their friends might know they're a furry, maybe some members of their family know they're a furry, but they typically don't tell their work friends. They're really judicious in when they choose to talk to other people about their furry interest. Which, by the way, means if you're a parent of a furry and you know that your kid is a furry, you're doing something right because your kid trusts you enough to come to you. And I know a lot of furries in this room kind of wish that was the case for them. So again, to the parents who are here with their kids, you're doing something right, and we applaud you for that. All right. So what drives furries? Why do this thing? Because I just finished talking about how furries get bullied for this. So why would you do it? Why would you bother belonging to a group that you're just going to get bullied for? And I've heard this question asked, which is kind of the wrong question in some ways, isn't it? Right? Kid, why are you doing this thing you're getting bullied for? There was a case a few years ago in the Brony fandom of a little boy named Grayson who wore his Rainbow Dash backpack to school. And he got bullied and picked on for it, right? Why do you like this thing for little girls? And the principal of his school told him, well, just don't wear your Rainbow Dash backpack to school, right? That's the opinion of a lot of folks. You like a weird thing, just stop liking that weird thing. You're defending the bullies in some way, right? So why do you do it, furries? Well, when we ask where it came from, where did this start? As it turns out, well, it came from a lot of things, right? There's no one way into furry, but we'll see here that Disney played a role. But also the internet, artwork, some feeling inside of them. This wasn't just something that they decided on a whim one day. right? For many furries, they were searching for something piqued their interest, and they went with it, right? This isn't something deviant for many of them. This was just a natural hobby. It could have been anime, it could have been anything else, right? But it happened to be furry that struck their interest. And some of the research we've done has shown that for many furries, a big difference between furries and other fans and other people is that it allows this sense of self-expression, even more than anime fans, even though more than sport fans. This is a part of being able to express a part of yourself that you often don't get to express in day-to-day life, in a world where you're mocked and made fun of for being different. So when you look at why furries do it, what compels them, you can see some of the biggest ones are, because it's fun as shit, but also escapism, right? We live in a world that kind of sucks sometimes if you're a weirdo. So here's a place where I can just be a weirdo and be among other weirdos, and that's okay, right? And we see that for a lot of furries, they surround themselves with other furries. For many furries who don't have a lot of other friends, the fandom is where they make those friends, right? And indeed, we are a social species. Humans didn't survive as long as we did by being the strongest or the fastest thing on the Serengeti. We survived by building tribes, by surrounding ourselves with other people. We are at our core instinctively a social species, and that's where our resilience comes from. And so when you ask furries, right, despite all this bullying, despite being picked on, why do you do it? They say, well, because my friends are furries. Because when life gets really tough, those are the people who are there for me. So let's talk about mental health in the furry fandom. We know for a fact that having to hide a part of yourself is one of the worst things you can do to a person. We've seen this in research on gay people who are forced to hide being gay in the workplace, experience significant stress. And stress is one of the worst things you can do to a person's physical health. The need to conceal, the need to hide some part of yourself takes its toll on your well-being. We've done studies that have found this with furries. The more you're able to live openly, not only are you a happier person, but you're a healthier person as well. It's better for your heart. It's better for your immune system. It's better for your ability to sleep, right? But what's remarkable is despite this history of being bullied and picked on, something that we know is one of the worst things you can do to someone, furries aren't doing so bad. Furries are fairly comparable when it comes to things like self-esteem and life satisfaction. So what gives? They should be screwed up because of all this bullying, but they're not. And time after time, when we look at these studies comparing furries to other groups, we find that's because the fandom provides them with friends. The fandom provides them with people who help them. When life gets tough, it's the furries you're turning to first, right? We found this with COVID-19. It was a difficult time. We often trivialize it or forget about it, but not all of us made it through that pandemic. And for a lot of us who struggled during that, it was the furries that we were turning to, right? Only your significant other was someone you turned to more, right? Furries were turning to other furries before they were turning to their families in many cases, right? These are the people who are here for you when the chips are down. That's the part of the story that often gets missed by the media, right? Why do you do it? Yeah, it's fun, but also, right? What other people take for granted. I have my church group. I have my family. I have my work friends. For furries, very often, these are all you've got. This is who you have in your corner. So let's not undervalue that these are the people we turn to for inspiration, for social support. These are the people who motivate us, who save our lives in many cases. And when we ask the furry fandom, has this fandom changed you? Has spending time in this place changed you? 88% of furries say yes, and of those people, 91.7% say it's been for the better. Let's not forget that. What's a segue? Right. So we're going to finish up with the sex and porn stuff. I put it at the end so that if you're squicked out by this topic, if you'd rather not, if you have a kid and you'd rather bail out on this part, this is the time to do so. I'm not going to show anything graphic or anything, but we are going to talk about sex and porn, and for some folks that makes them uncomfortable, so you're welcome to leave. All right, let's talk about sex and porn in the fandom. So, let me preface all of this. A lot of people will say furries, you know what furries are like. They're kinky, they're sexual, they're promiscuous. You know what furries are like. And I want to argue that furries, sorry, my voice is going. I'm going to argue that furries are probably no more sexual than anyone else. We just talk about it more. And here's what I mean. This is one of my favorite findings. We asked furries and anime fans and bronies, hypothetically, in an upcoming study. We're not even going to ask you now, but hypothetically, in a future study, if we were to ask you about sex stuff, how open would you be on a 1 to 7 scale? And anime fans and bronies said, straight up, I'm gonna lie to you about some things. Furries, yeah, what do you want to know? So if furries come across looking a little more kinky, looking a little more into sex stuff, is it because they're actually more into this, or they're just telling you the truth? Keep that in mind. All right, how frequently do furries talk about porn in fandom spaces? A lot. Some furries would prefer not to, but let's be real, porn comes up in a lot of contexts in the furry fandom. However, there's this misconception that the furry fandom is only about porn. So we asked furries, right? Is furry content that you consume, is it all porn or not? And the white bars, right, is the content you consume sexual in nature? Super mixed bag. Is it non-sexual in nature? Right? Furries just like furry content, as it turns out. If there's boobs and butts in it, that's cool. But also furry content is cool. One of my favorite movies of all time is Terminator, a science fiction classic. There's a sex scene in it. Does my liking that movie mean I've got a robot fetish? No, I like science fiction, and hey, sex is pretty cool too. But I'm here for this. I'm here for the killer robots, right? So to clarify, right, is sex what defines the furry fandom? We asked furries, to what extent are these things a defining feature of the fandom? And you'll notice, sex is pretty low on the list. It's not the biggest factor, but it's also not the smallest factor. It's a factor. There's a tendency to be polarized here into either saying furry is all sex or furry is not sex at all, and to pretend it's one of these two extremes. There's nuance there that I think we often miss here, right? When we ask furries, is sexual attraction part of why you're here? Furries will say, to some extent. Not all furries. A lot of furries say, no, sex is not at all why I'm here. A lot of furries are kind of like, right? It's there, but it's not the whole story, right? And then we can get even more subtle with this, right? Because when we say you're interested in furry, well, what is furry? Furry is big and broad. When you go topic by topic, you realize that this question has a tremendous amount of nuance, right? Is sexual interest more important than other interests, like interacting with others? You'll notice that sex tends to be the biggest driver of like furry content interest specifically, right? But is that the reason why you're going to conventions? Is that the reason why you're fursuiting? Is that the reason why you're hanging out with furries? No. The vast majority of the interest in sex has to do with the arts. Yeah, porn is kind of cool, but also I'm here for a lot more than just that. What this model is essentially saying, this is a paper we published a couple of years ago. Essentially, when you pit non-sexual and sexual motivation against each other to see which one is a better predictor of being a furry, non-sexual motivation completely wins out the day, completely overpowers it, right? Porn is there, sex is there, but that's not what makes you a furry, right? And again, nuance is important. And I'm going to show you why nuance is important. I'm going to show you what happens when irresponsible people with an agenda tell a story about furry data, and why we at FurScience push back against this. So, are furries sexually attracted to anthropomorphic animal characters? From not at all to extremely. Yeah. Okay, put cat ears and a tail on it and furries love it. Okay. Are furries attracted to humans? Also, yes, right? There's this belief, oh, furries can't be attracted to humans. Not at all. Furries are also attracted to humans. But this last one is important for nuance. Are you sexually attracted to non-anthropomorphic animals? Now, we've seen people, academics, take this data, the dark gray bars here, and say, oh, there's a clear trend here. They said, oh, 64% said not at all. 36% of furries are sexually attracted to animals. You can see how that's a disingenuous representation of the data. That is not an accurate description of what is clearly the trend here. You are missing the forest for the trees here, right? Is furry porn a thing? Absolutely. Do furries look at it? So do non-furries. About 60% of furries say they look at furry porn every day. That's because about 60% of furries go on FA and check Fur Affinity, and hey, there's porn on the front page of that, right? About 68% of furries say they look at furry content in general every day. So furries just like furry content. If it's pornographic, cool. If it's not, that's also cool, right? Only about half the content they consume is erotic in nature. So it's not accurate one way or another to paint it as not sexual or entirely sexual, right? Most of the porn that furries consume is furry themed in nature. But again, it's not to the exclusion of non-furry porn. There's this belief that if you look at furry porn, you suddenly lose the ability to be attracted to humans. Not at all. Okay, this one. Have you discovered kinks through the furry fandom? Most furries will say, kinda, yeah. For many furries, they'll say, look, I was a fairly vanilla person, and through the fandom and its open discussion of kinks and stuff, I learned some things about myself. It didn't make you a kinky person, it made you discover things about yourself that were already kind of there, but you sort of discovered. Do you have fetishes that furries would think are weird? Generally no, because many furries say, well, hey, furries are a pretty accepting group of people. Here's the kink list. This list is about 3,000 items long. I'm not exaggerating. I had to condense it. Let me tell you a quick story about destroying my Google search history at school. Okay, I'm a psychologist. Okay, cognitive behavioral therapy is a type of therapy with the acronym CBT. So I, in my naivete, what are your kinks and fetishes? Someone said CBT. I said, how wholesome. So I looked up what a CBT kink looked like. Do not look up what a CBT kink looks like. Sorry, I'm not kink shaming, but also don't look at that on a public computer. So you'll see here some of the most common themes here, right? BDSM. That's not just a furry thing, right? That's one of the most common kinks and fetishes out there, right? Some of these a little more furry themes. Transformation, right? That's not uniquely furry, but that's got some pretty furry curves to it. Zoophilia. Let's talk about zoophilia. There's this perception of furries. Oh, furries sexually attracted to anthropomorphic animal characters, therefore furries must be zoophiles. About 13.3% of furries say there's some interest in zoophilia, which means, by extension, that 86.7% of furries, the overwhelming majority, say, that's not one of my interests, right? And if you think that's high, in the general population, that's been clocked at anywhere from, depending on the estimates, 2 to 8, or even as high as 15% of the general population. Furries didn't invent it. The vast majority of zoophiles are not furries. The vast majority of furries are not zoophiles, right? To contextualize this data, we asked furries, how do you feel towards different categories of art? From a 0 to 100 scale, 100 meaning you love it, 0 meaning you hate it. Furries like digital art, traditional art. Furries hate AI art. Artists in particular hate AI art. But going down this list, furries mostly like not safe for work art featuring non-human animals. It's pretty telling. Furries aren't a huge fan of this, right? Not what you'd expect if furries were zoophiles, right? The fandom as a whole tends to condemn this sort of attraction, tends to condemn this kind of artwork. Indeed, when we ask furries, how supportive are you of different types of relationships? And overwhelmingly, furries are supportive of all of these, with one exception, human-animal relationships. So again, categorizing furries as people who are interested in zoophilia is missing the forest for the trees. You're looking at one piece of data and ignoring the fact that as a group, furries really don't have a positive attitude towards zoophilia. If you want to see this for yourself, go on Twitter and call yourself a zoophile and see what happens. Furries in general, however, tend to be very positive towards fetish arts, right? Most furries will say, I like all kinds of fetish art. Now, some furries will say, most fetish art, there's one or two that squeak me, but in general, furries are very sex positive. You got a kink, you got a fetish, that might not be my cup of tea, but absolutely, power to you. What's really telling, this figure, the short version of this figure, is we asked furries, do you consider furry to be a fetish? And then we asked them, to what extent do you think the average furry considers furry to be a fetish? And what we found is that furries assume the average furry is more likely to call it a fetish than they themselves do. Furries assume that other furries are perverts. Furries assume that other furries are really highly sexual. But oftentimes it's an over-assumption, it's an overestimation. When you actually ask them, furries are often a little more vanilla than perhaps they'd admit, or they at very least assume the fandom is kinkier than they actually are. All right, I want to finish up by talking about pup play, or pet play perhaps more broadly. This is another one that was brought to our attention here by pet players who asked us, hey, study pet play. So we did. So here's what we started to find. The fandom tends to be fairly positive towards pet play as a group. There's this tendency, and we ourselves were kind of guilty of doing this. I thought, how many pet players can there actually be out there? It can't be that popular. Turns out it's about 11 to 17% of furries. That's a lot. So a lot of furries are into pet play. There's this other perception that, oh, pet players are coming into this fandom and taking it over and ruining it. We saw this with bronies, right? When there were bronies in the fandom, oh, those damn bronies are ruining it for everyone. They're coming in from the outside and wrecking everything. And what we saw with the bronies were, the call was coming from inside the house, right? It wasn't bronies coming into the fandom, it's people who were already furries becoming bronies. In many of these cases, this is what's happening with pet players, right? They're not pet players coming into the furry fandom, they're furries discovering they're into pet play. They're just as furry as non-furry, or as non-pet players are. They are twice as likely to be therians, which is not the same thing as saying all pet players are therians, but they're a little more likely to be therians than non-pet players are. They're also more likely to use the fandom for things like social support and exploring parts of their identity. They also tend to be significantly more kinky, and they're much more likely to say that pet play is sexual for them than non-sexual. I also want to use the term pet play here because it was pointed out to me. This is again, furries correcting us. I was using the term pup play initially, and they said, you know, not all pet players are pup players. And I'm like, really? And I studied it, and it turns out only about half of pet players are pup players. So pet play is the more inclusive term. So we asked, right, is it a sexual thing? Is it a romantic thing? Is it a social thing? Is it a purely platonic thing? Kind of a mixed bag. Sex is definitely a part of it for many, but not all, pet players. But there's also a romantic component in many cases. There's also a social component in many cases. And for some, it's completely platonic, right? So it would be wrong to paint the entire pet play community with the same paintbrush. For many, it's sexual, not for all. And even for whom it is sexual, it's also a lot more than that, right? We are creatures of nuance, if nothing else. And when you ask pet players, why do you do it? It's a mixed bag of things. Everything from it's fun to be something not human, to a lot of my friends are into it, to I really like the aesthetics, I like the way it looks, to it's fun. I put on my pet play mask and it's really fun for me, right? It's a lot of things for a lot of folks. So again, let's not paint them all with the same brush. And let's wrap it up here. So time-wise, I think I'm probably a little bit over my hour and a half because I spent some time crying at the beginning, but we're good. We got through this together. So thank you very much for being nerds and listening to a nerd talk for 90 minutes at a furry convention. There are many other things you could be doing, and I'm touched that you're spending it here with me. To remind you, everything we've talked about today and much, much, much more is available in our book, FurScience, which you can download for free at FurScience.com. On Amazon, it is available for purchase there. If you want to get in touch with me, you can go to the FurScience website and find my contact information there. My email address is also here. If you email me, I will send you a copy of the slide deck. So for those of you who want to share this with your friends or just have the slides to go through and nerd out to, you can feel free to get in touch with me. And I think we're going to wrap it up there, and I'll take Q&A afterwards. But for those who want to leave without Q&A, now is a good time to leave. I'll give a couple minutes. And for whoever's left, we'll do Q&A for, I think I have 20 minutes. So thank you very much, everyone, for staying this long. And if you are taking off through the Phantom, were you...
It's a direct question.
Yeah, we asked directly, yeah. All right, so, yes.
I just want to say to all the people who think sex is weird, 99% odds, bet more than that, you are the result of sex. No, it's not weird.
All right. Forgive me for sitting down and being a lazy bastard, but I just talked for 90 minutes, so I'm going to sit down for a moment. For Q&A, I'm just going to kind of sort of pan back and forth and try to give everyone a chance. We only got 20 minutes, so I'll try to keep it quick, try to keep your questions quick. And again, if I don't get to your question, I will be at my table all day tomorrow. I will listen to you and answer all your questions to your heart's content tomorrow. But if you got quick ones, we'll rifle through them kind of quickly. We'll sort of go right to left and back, and I'll try to be quick. So, yes?
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Have you guys studied like the percentages of disabilities in the fandom, whether mental or physical?
Yes, we do. That is in the book. I think we have a whole chapter on it. Yeah, so part of the tricky part is, so one of the tricky parts we run into is with our ethics board. So I'm going to quiet my voice down. So one of the problems we run into with our ethics board is that as soon as we start digging too much into like mental illness or disability, we start wandering into clinically vulnerable territory. And as soon as we do that, all the rules suddenly change. So if we start getting too specific into it, they start saying, oh, well, if this is a clinically vulnerable population, you can't do it anonymously anymore. You have to have clinical support on staff. You have to and so suddenly it becomes 10 times harder to do research. So we try to get as close as possible to getting some of that data without getting so deep into it that we now have to suddenly have like 24/7 crisis care on hand to deal with it. So we've done sort of as much as we can on that subject, and we're still kind of dancing around it and working on specific inroads into it. But there are practical considerations as well. Yeah. So to keep panning over, yeah, in the front, did you have a question?
No, right.
In the back there, yeah.
Where's your table at?
My table? Oh, it is in front. If you walk into the dealer's den, before you walk into the dealer's den, we're just to the right of the door. Look for a bunch of people in white lab coats. We'll be there from like 9 to 5 tomorrow, I think. Yeah. Yes?
Have y'all studied furries who are parents likely to their child also?
Have we studied furry parents whose children might be furries as well? So one of the problems with that is called a subset of a subset. The last time we asked furries if they are parents, the answer was 4.2%, which is not a big chunk. So if you assume a sample of, say, 1,000 people, 40 of them will be parents statistically. So if we get a sample of 1,000 people, 40 of them will be parents. Many of them are fairly young themselves, so their children are like 4. So it's a little bit difficult to ask, at that point to tell if their kid is a furry yet. And even if there were some trends there, we'd be making a big claim about furries with parents from like 40 people, which we're a little hesitant to do. So fast forward another decade maybe, when those kids have had a chance to grow up and when more furries may have had kids, maybe it'll be a bit easier, but for now at least, it's really hard to get the numbers we need to have statistical power to make claims on that group. Yeah, good question. Yes?
I have 2 questions now. The first one is about the furries who are not from North Americans, which is the majority of them.
Yep.
Is totally different from the rest of them, or is you have a statistic for that?
Good question. So furries from outside of North America. So a lot of our research comes from conventions in North America. However, our online studies tend to be global. And we have, in recent years, gone outside of North America. 2 weeks ago, we did Nordic FuzzCon. A couple of years ago, or I guess 4 or 5 years ago now, we did EuroFurence. And we're going back to EuroFurence next year. So we've tried to reach outside. We've also had furries from other parts of the world who want to work with us. So we've had furries in Taiwan who translated our surveys for us. There's some interest in Poland in wanting to translate some of our surveys. There was a furry down in South Africa who, for a master's thesis, did some of our research down there, basically replicated one of our studies down there. There are some Chinese furries who wants to work with us and hopefully someday get us out to a furry convention out there as well. So part of the limitation is most of us on the team only speak English, and my French is pretty shit. So most of our bias is we're limited to wherever there are English speakers. But as the team grows and more people learn about our research, they are helping us to translate it and to collaborate with us. We don't necessarily want to be the only ones doing all the research. We love it when other people say, hey, we're doing research, give us one of your surveys and we'll run a study ourselves. And that's really cool too, so that we can sort of collaborate with other people, other teams, and it's not just us doing everything. And you had a second question, is it quick?
The second question is like, what is the limitation of a survey, like doing here, for example?
Yeah. So one of the limitations of a convention-based survey is that you're going to pull for older participants. You're going to pull for people with more expendable income. Those are two of the biggest biases we've seen. So we're mindful of that, and the book has an entire section comparing convention going to online samples. We've also tried comparing, say, North American samples to, say, European samples. Not a lot of differences that we found, very tiny little differences. Nothing that really jumps out at us. One of the only differences that I've seen regionally, there are more kangaroo furries in Australia. That one emerged. That's about the only one we've really seriously been able to find. However, some other data that people have sent to us, so not our data, have suggested when you look at Southeast Asia, Japanese furries are quite a bit different from other furries in Southeast Asia. So it may be in how it's construed, it may be they're less likely to perhaps see it as a fandom. Fursonas mean something very different in a lot of the Japanese fandom. We're not fully sure yet because we don't speak Japanese, but one of our goals in the next 2 or 3 years is to send a team to Japan to a Japanese furry convention and look into this more. So it's on the docket. But yeah, so that kind of answers your question, I hope. Yeah. All right, panning over. Yes.
You mentioned earlier, I believe, that you do not find strong evidence to support that a person's persona can tell you a lot about their personality or psyche, right?
Yes, only very small things typically.
Well, about 6 weeks ago I was at Annex, and there was a guy there who's into psychology and zoology. He studied like Freud and such, and at least on some scale, he believed that there's a pretty good chance that the animal we choose for our species does reflect certain aspects for ourselves. Like, for example, when he pulled up what a fox is associated with, they like consuming information but are loath to reveal it. And I walked up to him and I said, "Holy crap! How did you know?"
So I will. My response to that would be, our data tends to be very aggregated data. I think if you were, for example, to talk to a Freudian, if you were to go sort of individually, if I were to talk to an individual person and say, why did you pick your fursona species? I do think the species is not arbitrary, right? I chose cat for a reason. I grew up with cats, I love cats, right? So for individual furries, the fursona species is meaningful. But when you aggregate it, cats mean a lot of things. A furry can choose a cat because it's lazy, because it's adorable, because it's fiercely independent, because Garfield was their favorite comic growing up. Yeah, there's all sorts of reasons. So when you aggregate it, it kind of gets lost in the noise. But for individuals, the species is meaningful. But you can't make broad sweeping claims necessarily about what all foxes are like, all wolves are like. It mostly gets mashed out in the data there. Yes?
All right, so I had 2 questions. I would kind of be interested to know, one, how many furries are trying to have a different kink than what they have now, like trying to switch kinks, and how many furries have handlers versus how many don't?
Ooh.
I know that the handlers one might be obvious, but as
No, we've never asked about handlers. Hold on. Where did I throw my laptop? There it is.
yes, I was very cautious about handlers, which I like men.
I'm embarrassed that after 13 years and being a fursuiter myself, we have never asked about handlers. And this is where our ideas come from.
So you've never gone through with any other questionnaires about handlers and actually the whole thing with when you're working with fursuiters back and forth as a handler or anything else?
Never even thought to approach it before.
You asked that question back a few years yourself directly, kind of in a roundabout way. I think you were
Possibly roundabout, yeah.
because you were trying to get, I think, in the idea of whether it was because of a commissary between the two of us, and you made a reference toward the same thing as a handler being somebody who's actually more attuned to the character and everything else that this person is built.
I don't remember that, but I've also looked
Because
at
you
thousands of
actually
variables.
said, so do you understand more, what is going on with your person you're handling as an individual or not?
Yeah.
And you remember, I kind of looked at you, didn't know exactly how to answer the question.
Yeah. We'll have to do a more concerted look into it at very least.
Because that type of question, because it's a mixed bag, because they said, well, is it kind of like you're leading somebody on a leash, or you're sitting here and I was like, do I answer it in that nature, or do I sit here and answer it because if it's misleading in that's why it was like, okay.
Yeah.
How do I answer this? I said, that the way you just answered it is not gonna get an answer to that question.
Yeah. We'll have to look into it again. I don't recall this, but it's
Because
also been a while.
It was that type of question that was asked because the fact of the matter is that you had somebody who has a very limited visual acuity.
Yeah.
B, sensory is down already, and C, you have to act as that extension to them to do it.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, you're in tune. It's like, I didn't get what you were actually asking, because you even asked it on the questionnaire again, trying to clarify it up, and it was never really answered.
Yeah, we'll have to go back to it because I don't remember now how we asked it, and it's been a few years.
On the
So.
automated one, I was like, how exactly am I supposed to? I mean, I understand from the BDSM end of it, but that's not what it is.
Yeah, fair point. Also, you had a second part to your question was about kinks. Changing kinks.
Wanting to switch them, yes.
Yeah, wanting to switch kinks. I guess I've never thought about a person like making a concerted effort to try to change their kinks. We can ask about it. Yeah, it's never come up, but something we can ask about. All right.
Is post-con depression stronger in furries versus other?
Post-con depression. So we're studying it right now. Our Nordic FuzzCon data is looking at it. We have looked at it. Post-con depression is a thing. We've only studied it in furries. I haven't thought to look at it in other fandoms. It's really tough to do longitudinal studies in other fandoms, but it's something we could try to look at.
At least anime cons and sci-fi cons.
You can also see if it's related to sickness or if they were missing out on being with their friends or whatever did happen there.
We're doing a huge study right now at Nordic FuzzCon. We 2 weeks before the con, everyone was emailed the survey. At the con, people was emailed the survey, and then 2 weeks after they were emailed the survey. So we're going to look at who experienced post-con depression, and then can we see at the convention or before the convention, is there anything that can help us predict who is the most likely to develop post-con depression? Things like, do you get to go home to a bunch of friends? Things like, were you already in kind of a bad headspace before you left? Things like, how did your con experience go? So we're going to see, can we build a model that helps us predict beforehand who's the most likely to wind up with post-con depression, and can we use that to help target our focus? Yeah.
The thing that you'll find with that is that you have the support during con. Okay? Now that's going to diminish when you leave. You have to go back to real world.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, the thing it gets into is it's the same thing, and don't take this as a wrong way of doing it. But is it safe as a saying and aftercare afterwards? And that's the same issue as you're going into with the cons and everything else.
Yeah.
And you have to use the same mentality, or it's the same model on a psychological level, because
Support.
it's the same thing as a support and everything else after all the same and everything has happened.
Yeah.
During, because those connections are there and everything else. but you have to have the aftercare and actually sit here and be able to say, hey, we're gonna go ahead and reach out together as a community and still go ahead with this. We went to these cons, it's gonna, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's just to know that you have your local community and everything else that you also sometimes will lean heavily on after a good con. And most of them at been to cons understand this is what's going on.
Yeah. All right, so we'll see back here. Yes.
I noticed you use a lot of, you use the anime fans as for reference and for
Yeah.
data. I feel like in the last 10 years, I would dare to say anime has become mainstream.
Yeah.
Does that affect your data because there's such a change?
That's actually part of the reason why we wanted to compare furries to anime fans, because anime fans are a really nice comparison because they're a media-based fan group, and there's some stigma towards them, but not as much stigma as directed towards furries, precisely because I think it's more mainstream. So they're a really nice foil because they're all also very comparable in age to furries. There's even some conceptual overlap and some population overlap. About 40 to 50% of furries are anime fans themselves. So it makes it a really nice point of comparison. Bronies were also a popular comparison that we used because they're conceptually, there's a lot of overlap, like walking, talking horses, walking, talking animal characters. So.
And also to the other stuff that we get into, like Republican and everything else.
Yep.
Now, that's also why I tend to sit here and be kind of careful with how I'm saying that, because so it's not misconstrued as being used within the type of context that you're talking about. As a handler and also as somebody who's been in the fandom since 79,
yeah.
since 75, grew up in the fandom and have a family member within it. So it is a different precept from looking at something saying, well, this is not normie, but this is something that has been under tableau.
Yeah.
Okay, and for those who do not understand what tableau means, it means that you are in costume and should conceal.
Yeah.
And
the magic.
That's a different point because you have people that are executives in Disney and stuff like that do come through these halls.
Yeah.
And you will never know.
Yeah.
But the thing that it's just like when you had asked that initial question, I kind of looked at you, you did apologize for saying it, because you were like, that was out. I go, no, it wasn't. It was just not worded right. And that's the thing about it, because we all experience the highs and lows during the cons, whether it be Comic-Con or whether it be
I think we have 1 minute.
AnimeCon or that too, because I did both.
Yeah.
And the difference with me is that I've learned over the years that the high and low on it of having all the support within the group, then having to go back into a situation where you have little or no support causes that.
I think it's part of what we hypothesized too. Yeah.
And that was part of the stuff that I looked at your studies, and also the studies coming out of Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And those were the primary ones. The A&M study and the Pittsburgh study are more important with the book, also going into that data and stuff like that to help those furries, those people who are in anime, to communicate back into not only their own families and everything else.
Yeah.
Because you have been pretty key in doing that with a lot of younger ones coming into the fandom.
Yeah.
And that is something I really do appreciate coming from the psychiatric level of it.
Thank you. We do have to wrap up here just because they're going to be using the room for the next event. And plus I have to run off to my werewolves panel. Thank you very much. And like I said, if you have other questions, drop by our table tomorrow. I will happily let you talk my ear off. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.